Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija Board. Told me a stranger was watching. I found a man in my backyard. Part 1. It was just a game, right? Okay, so before anyone says anything, yeah, I know how this sounds. And trust me, I'm not the kind of person who usually believes in this stuff. I'm the guy who watches scary movies and laughs at the dumb decisions characters make, right? Like, oh sure, let's go into the creepy basement alone. Nothing bad ever happens there. I'm skeptical by nature. Or at least I was. This whole thing started about 3 weeks ago, on a Saturday night. My friend group and I were hanging out, and it was one of those typical nothing-to-do nights. You know, those nights where you're all just scrolling through your phones, hoping something interesting will happen. Yeah, that. Anyway, my buddy Mark says, "Hey, let's mess around with the Ouija board I found in my attic." Now, I've never actually touched one of those things before. I've always seen them as just another weird board game, like Monopoly but with extra spook points. I wasn't really into the idea, but what else were we going to do? I figured it was just going to be another goofy night, with us making fun of each other and freaking out over nothing. So, we lit some candles, for the aesthetic, as Katie put it, and gathered around the table. The board itself was old, like really old. The edges were frayed, and the letters had faded a bit. Mark said it had been his grandpa's or something. It smelled like dust and something else I couldn't quite place. Something kinda off. But I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just an old piece of cardboard, right? Mark started off by asking dumb questions like, "Is anyone here?" and "Are there any spirits that want to talk to us?" We all giggled when nothing happened, and honestly, I was already getting bored. Katie was playing on her phone, Mark was taking this weirdly seriously, and I was trying not to yawn. Then, just as I was about to make some joke to lighten the mood, the planchette moved. Like, it moved. And not in the someone's pushing it way. I mean, it slid smoothly across the board, as if it had a mind of its own. I immediately laughed it off. "Yeah, real funny, guys," I said. Mark swore up and down that he wasn't touching it, and so did Katie, who had barely been paying attention. But honestly, it was still kind of weird. I could feel a chill settle in the room, and suddenly, it didn't feel like such a joke anymore. "What's your name?" Mark asked the board. Slowly, the planchette began to spell out letters. A-D-A-M. "Adam?" "That's kind of lame for a ghost name," Katie said, half laughing, but I noticed her eyes weren't leaving the board. "What do you want, Adam?" Mark asked, his voice just a little shaky now. The planchette moved again. H-E-I-S-W-A-T-C-H-I-N-G. We all looked at each other, the air in the room growing heavier by the second. "Who's watching?" I asked, finally speaking up, not even sure why I did. My heart was beating a little faster now. It was probably just one of them messing with me, right? The planchette slid around the board again. Katie let out a nervous laugh, clearly trying to brush it off, but none of us were laughing anymore. My mouth felt dry. There was something about the way it moved. Too smooth, too fast. I glanced out the window behind me, half expecting to see something or someone standing there in the dark. But there was nothing. Just my backyard, stretching out into the shadows of the night. Mark cleared his throat. "Adam, who's watching?" The planchette jerked suddenly, almost violently, pointing to the corner of the board where the word "goodbye" was written. Then it stopped moving, dead still. We all stared at each other for a minute, trying to process what had just happened. Well, that was fun. Mark said, trying to break the tension. He reached out to pack up the board, but I could tell he was a little freaked out too. We all were. Something about the whole thing just felt wrong. It was like we had asked a question we weren't supposed to, and now there was this heavy silence hanging over us. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a game. Maybe Mark was messing with us, or maybe the board had been warped from age and dust. I wasn't about to get sucked into some weird supernatural nonsense. But then, later that night, as I was lying in bed, I started hearing things. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, my brain playing tricks on me because we'd been talking about spooky stuff. But it kept happening. Soft shuffling sounds outside my window, like footsteps, but slow, almost deliberate. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe a stray cat or something. But when I finally got the nerve to look outside, I didn't see anything, just the same empty yard, bathed in the faint glow of the streetlight. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. That's when I remembered what the Ouija board had said. He is watching. Part 2. The Backyard Visitor. I didn't sleep much that night. Even though I tried to brush it off, those footsteps kept replaying in my head. I kept convincing myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up for no reason? Like, you know you're not alone, even if you can't see anyone around. Yeah, that feeling stuck with me long after the Ouija board was put away. The next day, I was pretty much a zombie. Barely any sleep, and an uneasy feeling lingering in my gut. I tried to go about my day as normal. Went to work, met up with friends afterward. The usual stuff. But I couldn't stop thinking about that message. He is watching. Watching what? Watching who? By the time I got home that night, the sun was already setting. My backyard has always felt a little creepy at night. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so it's not like there's a ton of noise or streetlights around to make things less ominous. I never really cared about it before, but after last night, I found myself locking all the doors and double-checking the windows before I even thought about relaxing. I decided to chill out on the couch with some mindless TV. Anything to take my mind off the weirdness from the night before. Everything was fine for a while. I actually started to feel a bit dumb for letting that stupid Ouija board session get under my skin. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. That same shuffling sound. Soft, but unmistakable. At first, I froze. My TV was still on, some random sitcom playing in the background, but I couldn't focus on anything but that noise. It was like it was coming from just outside my living room window, near the back of the house. I muted the TV, straining to listen. The sound stopped for a second, and I let out a breath, telling myself it was nothing. Probably an animal again. A raccoon, maybe. But then it started up again. Closer this time. Slow. Like someone was deliberately dragging their feet across the grass outside. I stood up, my heart pounding in my ears, and grabbed my phone. The logical part of my brain told me to just look out the window, prove to myself it was nothing. But I wasn't feeling logical. I was feeling like a 5-year-old scared of the dark, convinced there was something lurking just out of sight. My kitchen window faces the backyard, so I crept over there, trying not to make a sound. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of the yard through the thin fabric. I hesitated for a second, my fingers hovering over the edge of the curtain. My pulse was racing now, and I had this irrational fear that the second I pulled the curtain back, I'd see someone standing right there, staring at me. After what felt like forever, I finally pulled the curtain aside. At first, I saw nothing. Just the usual, the patio, the lawn chairs, the shadowy outline of the fence. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something, or someone, standing just beyond the reach of the light, near the tree at the far end of my backyard, was a man. I could barely make him out, He was tall, maybe 6 feet, and just standing there, not moving, not looking around, just watching. His face was hidden in the shadow of the tree, but his posture made it clear he was staring right at my house, right at me. My mouth went dry, and I immediately backed away from the window, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. I grabbed my phone and considered calling the cops, but then I stopped. What was I going to say? That there was some random guy standing in my backyard? He wasn't doing anything, not trying to break in, not yelling or anything. Just standing there, watching. I thought maybe it was some drunk neighbor who wandered into the wrong yard or a teenager messing around, but deep down, I knew better. There was something too deliberate about the way he stood there, like he was waiting. I checked the locks on all the doors again, making sure they were secure, and tried to convince myself to just ignore it. After all, I couldn't stay up all night watching my backyard like some paranoid weirdo. Whoever it was, they'd eventually leave, right? But I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of shuffling feet or the creak of a door opening. Every little noise made me jump, and as I lay there, my mind kept circling back to one thing. That damn Ouija board. He is watching. The next morning, I went outside to check the backyard in the daylight. Part of me expected to find some kind of evidence that I'd just imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just tired, freaked out from the Ouija session, and let my brain create a scenario that wasn't really there. But then I saw the footprints. They weren't super obvious, but they were there, pressed into the dirt near the tree where I'd seen the figure. And they weren't animal tracks either. They were footprints, barefoot to be exact. The prints were large, probably from a grown man, but something about them seemed wrong. They were deep in the soil, like whoever had made them was standing there for a long time. I stared at those prints for a good 5 minutes, trying to make sense of it. They led a few steps away from the tree, toward the house, but then stopped. No trail leading to the fence, no other signs that someone had walked around, just those few deliberate steps. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The grass around the footprints, where the man had been standing, was dead. Not just trampled or damaged, but completely withered, like it had been scorched or something. I crouched down and touched it, half expecting it to crumble under my fingers, and sure enough, it did. I pulled back, feeling an uneasy twist in my gut. This wasn't normal. This wasn't someone messing around. I don't know why, but I suddenly had the urge to dig out the Ouija board and ask it more questions. But then I remembered the way the planchette had moved that first night, how it had pointed so abruptly to goodbye. Whatever this was, I didn't think it wanted to answer any more questions, and frankly, I wasn't sure I wanted to ask. But as I stood there, staring at those footprints, I couldn't help but feel like whoever, or whatever, had been in my backyard wasn't done with me yet. Part 3. He came closer. For the next few days, I tried to pretend everything was normal. You ever get that feeling where, if you ignore something long enough, it'll just go away? Yeah, I was banking on that. I didn't talk about what I'd seen. I didn't bring it up to my friends. I sure as hell didn't mention the footprints. I just kept telling myself it was some prank, that I'd been tired and freaked out, and my brain had done the rest. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the feeling never went away. That heavy, sinking dread that someone was watching me. Every time I walked into a room with windows, I found myself glancing outside, just waiting to see that shadowy figure again. I started closing my blinds during the day, which felt ridiculous. But then again, everything about this situation felt ridiculous. For a few nights, things were quiet. No shuffling footsteps, no random noises outside. Just the usual crickets chirping in the distance and the occasional sound of a car driving by. I started to think maybe, just maybe, I'd been overreacting. Maybe that guy had wandered off, found somewhere else to stand around like a creep. I even got a full night's sleep for the first time in days. But of course it didn't last. It was around midnight when it happened again. I was brushing my teeth, getting ready for bed, when I heard it. That same soft, deliberate shuffling outside. Only this time, it was different. It was closer. My bathroom window is small, high up on the wall, but it still looks out into the backyard. I froze, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, straining to listen. The sound wasn't coming from the far end of the yard this time. No, it was right outside, like someone was walking just beneath the window. I put the toothbrush down, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of the bathroom, to close the door and pretend I didn't hear anything. But instead, I found myself inching toward the window, my feet moving almost on their own. It was like some part of me needed to see, needed to know for sure that this was real. The shuffling stopped. I reached the window and, barely breathing, peeked through the edge of the blinds. At first, I couldn't see anything, just the same shadowy outline of the backyard, the grass swaying gently in the wind. But then, as I adjusted my eyes to the dark, I saw him. He was standing right at the base of the house, directly beneath the bathroom window. The same tall, shadowy figure, only this time I could see him more clearly. The faint light from the moon illuminated the outline of his face, or rather, the lack of one. His features were vague, almost blurred, like someone had smudged a painting of a man's face. There were no eyes, just dark hollows where they should have been. His skin looked wrong, like it didn't fit him properly, like it was stretched too tight over his bones. And he was looking up, directly at the window, directly at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the sink. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I scrambled for my phone, hands shaking as I dialed Mark's number. I don't know why I didn't call the police. Maybe because deep down, I knew they wouldn't believe me. Maybe because I didn't want to explain what I was seeing. "Dude, it's midnight," Mark answered, his voice groggy. "Mark, there's someone in my backyard," I whispered, gripping the phone like it was some kind of lifeline. My voice was barely steady. "What? Wait, what the hell are you talking about?" I peeked out the window again, but the man was gone. Just like that, vanished into the night. The spot where he had been standing was empty, as if he'd never been there at all, but I knew what I saw. I couldn't have imagined something like that, not with those hollow eyes staring up at me. "I saw him," I said, my voice shaking. "That guy, he's back. He was standing right outside my house." "Hold up, you're serious?" "I'm dead serious." Mark was quiet for a second. Then he sighed. "All right, I'm coming over. Stay inside. Keep your doors locked. I'll be there in 10. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and hung up. My hands were still trembling, and I could barely focus as I went through the house, checking every window and door again. I felt like a paranoid wreck, but I didn't care. There was no way I was taking any chances with whatever was lurking outside. Mark showed up about 15 minutes later, looking half awake, but concerned. He didn't even make a joke about how freaked out I looked, which told me he could see how serious I was. We sat down in the living room, and I explained everything. The footsteps, the guy standing under the tree, the footprints in the backyard, and of course, the thing I had just seen outside my window. Mark didn't say much while I talked. He just nodded, his brow furrowed in that way he does when he's really thinking. When I finally finished, he sat back on the couch and let out a long breath. "So, what do you think this is?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't know, man. It's not just some guy messing around. It can't be. Not after what I saw. There's something wrong with him." Mark didn't argue. He just looked at me, and for a moment, I could see that he was spooked too. And Mark doesn't get scared easily. We sat there in silence for a while, both of us trying to make sense of what was happening. Then, out of nowhere, There was a knock at the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My entire body tensed up, and I shot Mark a look. He glanced at the door, then back at me, his face pale. The knock came again, louder this time. Mark stood up, motioning for me to stay where I was. He walked to the door, peeking through the peephole. For a long second, he didn't move, just stood there staring. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mark pulled away from the peephole, his face a shade paler than before. "No one's there." I got up, rushing over to look for myself. But sure enough, the porch was empty, no one in sight. Mark opened the door, stepping out onto the front porch. He looked around, checking both sides of the house, but there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. That's when we heard it. From the backyard. The sound of soft, deliberate footsteps on the grass. Mark and I stood there, frozen for a second. Then, without saying a word, we both ran to the back of the house. I hesitated for a moment before peeking out through the kitchen window. There he was, standing just a few feet from the house now, closer than ever before. His blurred face tilted slightly up toward the window, those hollow, empty eyes staring right through the glass. And this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, standing just inside the tree line, were more figures. Dark shapes, barely visible, their faces just as vague and wrong as his. They didn't move, they just stood there, watching. My blood ran cold. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. Mark took one look and cursed under his breath. "I don't know what this is," I whispered, "but it's not going away." Part 4. The knock came again. We slammed the back door shut, locking it like that was going to help. Mark's face was pale, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the lock. I could tell he was trying to keep it together for my sake, but we were both freaking out at this point. Whatever was happening, it was beyond anything either of us could explain. And now, it wasn't just one figure. There were more. A lot more. I backed away from the door, feeling my heart race. "What are they?" I asked, though I wasn't expecting Mark to have an answer. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I have no idea, man. I've never seen anything like this. But they're not..." He stopped, his voice catching in his throat. "They're not human." We stood there in silence for a minute, listening. I couldn't hear anything outside now. No shuffling, no footsteps, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. It was almost worse than the sound of them walking around. At least when they were moving, I could track them. But now they were just waiting. And the worst part, they weren't going anywhere. Mark was pacing back and forth, muttering something about how we needed a plan. I wasn't even listening. My mind was stuck on that image. Those faceless figures, standing there, staring at my house. I could feel their presence, like they were still watching me, even though I couldn't see them. It was almost as if they were waiting for something. Then, there was another knock. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was coming from the back. The same slow, deliberate knock that had sent my heart racing earlier. Mark stopped pacing, and we both stared at the door. Neither of us moved. The knock came again, louder. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's no way I'm opening that door." "Yeah," Mark agreed. "No way." We stood there, paralyzed, staring at the door like it was going to burst open any second. I don't know why, but I had this awful feeling in my gut. Like if we opened that door, something terrible would happen. Maybe that was the whole point. Maybe they wanted us to open it. But I wasn't about to test that theory. Suddenly, Mark's phone buzzed. The sound was jarring in the silence, and we both jumped. He fumbled it out of his pocket, checking the screen. "It's Katie," he said, glancing at me. "I'm going to put her on speaker." I nodded, and he answered the call, his voice a little too high-pitched. Katie, thank God you called. Something really messed up is happening here. I know, Katie interrupted, her voice shaky. I think it's happening to me too. My stomach dropped. Wait, what? What do you mean? I was asleep, she said, her voice barely a whisper, and I heard knocking at my window. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I saw them, standing in my backyard. Mark and I exchanged a look. I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. Whatever this was, it wasn't just happening here. It was spreading. How many? Mark asked, trying to keep his voice calm. I don't know, Katie replied. 3, maybe 4? They just stand there. They haven't moved. Mark swore under his breath, rubbing his temples like he was trying to make sense of all this. Okay, Katie, listen. Don't go near the window. Don't open any doors. Just stay away from them. We'll figure this out. Katie's voice wavered. What do you think they want? I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I knew was that these things, whatever they were fixated on us, and I had a horrible feeling that this wasn't going to end well. Another knock echoed through the house, this time louder than before, like whoever or whatever was outside was getting impatient. I flinched, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. Mark shot me a look and I could see the fear in his eyes now, the same fear that was gnawing at me. We can't stay here, I whispered. They're not going to leave. Mark nodded. Agreed. But where do we go? If Katie's seeing them too, they're not just here. They could be anywhere. I hadn't thought of that. It wasn't like we could just pack up and leave town. I didn't even know if running would help. These things seemed to know exactly where we were, like they could track us no matter where we went. Before we could come up with any kind of plan, there was another noise. But this one wasn't a knock. It was the sound of glass shattering. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw the back window had been smashed. A rock lay on the floor, surrounded by broken glass, and the curtains were fluttering in the breeze. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stared at the broken window, the cold night air seeping into the room. Then I saw it. A hand. Slowly, it reached through the broken window, pale and skeletal, with fingers that were unnaturally long. It felt like time had slowed down, every movement exaggerated as the hand gripped the edge of the window frame. The skin was stretched too thin, almost translucent, with veins pulsing just beneath the surface. Mark swore and grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a lamp. He swung it at the hand, but the second the lamp hit, the hand jerked back, disappearing into the night. I rushed over and pulled the curtains shut, my hands shaking. My brain was scrambling for any kind of explanation, but there wasn't one. This wasn't something we could rationalize. This wasn't human. I felt like I was losing my mind, like everything around me was collapsing into some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Mark was breathing heavily, clutching the lamp like it was some kind of weapon. We need to get out of here, now. I nodded, grabbing my keys from the counter. What about Katie? We'll pick her up, Mark said, already heading for the door. We can't leave her there. We moved quickly, adrenaline pushing us forward. The second we opened the front door, I was hit with that awful creeping sensation that we were being watched. I looked around, my eyes scanning the street, the shadows, but I couldn't see anything. That didn't mean they weren't there, though. I could feel them, watching, waiting. We ran to the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands still trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling that the second we turned our backs, those figures would swarm us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see them coming out of the shadows, but the street was eerily empty. We got in the car and peeled out of the driveway. Mark kept his eyes on the road, but I could tell he was just as shaken as I was. What if they follow us? I asked, my voice barely steady. Mark didn't answer right away. He just tightened his grip on the steering wheel. I don't know, man. I don't know. The drive to Katie's house was tense. Every shadow seemed to stretch out. Every figure in the distance looked like one of them. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those faceless things following us. But there was nothing. Just the empty streets and the suffocating darkness. When we finally pulled up to Katie's place, she was already standing on the porch, clutching her phone, her face pale. She ran to the car, and we didn't waste any time getting her inside. I saw more of them, she whispered as we sped away. They were getting closer. I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that we couldn't stop. We had to keep moving, keep running. But deep down, I knew we couldn't run forever, because wherever we went, they'd be there, watching. Part 5. Nowhere left to run. We drove in silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. The car's headlights sliced through the darkness. But outside those beams of light, the world felt empty. It was like we'd slipped into some alternate reality where nothing else existed but us and them. No people, no sound, just this heavy, oppressive quiet that made every nerve in my body scream. Katie was curled up in the back seat, her knees tucked to her chest, staring out the window like she was waiting for one of those figures to pop up in the shadows. Mark kept his eyes glued to the road, but I could tell he was on edge. Every few minutes, his grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "We can't keep driving all night," Katie finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look away from the window. "Where are we even going?" Mark shook his head. "I don't know. We just need to keep moving." But even as he said it, I could hear the doubt in his voice. Deep down, we all knew the truth. We couldn't outrun them. They were everywhere. No matter where we went, they would follow. And it wasn't just my house anymore. It was Katie's. Maybe more of our friends. Maybe more people we didn't even know. I looked out my own window, half expecting to see one of those hollow-eyed things pacing alongside the car, keeping up with us no matter how fast we went. But the road was empty. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Mark pulled into an empty gas station, the kind that looks like it hasn't seen customers in years. The neon open sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. There was a single overhead light buzzing above the pump, and beyond that, nothing but black. No other cars, no houses, just empty fields stretching out into the night. "I need to think," Mark muttered, killing the engine. "We can't keep driving aimlessly." Katie didn't say anything, just kept staring out the window like she expected something to happen at any second. I felt the same way, like the air around us was too still, too quiet. We were sitting ducks. I got out of the car, mostly because I couldn't stand the suffocating silence inside. The cool night air hit me, and for a second, I let myself believe that maybe we'd outrun them. Maybe this place was far enough away that they couldn't find us. But then I saw it. A shape, standing just beyond the reach of the gas station's flickering light, blending into the darkness. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then it shifted. Slowly, the faint outline of a man standing there, too still, too deliberate. One of them. My stomach dropped. I backed up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, but I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I glanced back at the car, but Katie and Mark hadn't noticed it yet. Then I saw another one. This one was closer, almost directly under the light now, its face still blurred, distorted, like someone had smeared it with their hand. I felt the same wave of nausea hit me as before, that unnatural wrongness about them, like they weren't supposed to exist. "Katie, Mark," I whispered, barely able to form the words. My mouth was dry, my body frozen with fear. They didn't hear me at first, so I said it louder. "Guys!" Mark turned, his eyes widening when he saw what I was looking at. Katie followed his gaze, and I heard her let out a small gasp, her hand covering her mouth. "They found us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the car. We need to go, now. I didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled back into the car and Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to get the engine started. The figures were still standing there, unmoving, but I could feel the weight of their gaze. They didn't have eyes, but somehow I knew they were watching us, waiting. The engine roared to life and Mark slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires squealing as we sped away from the gas station, the figures growing smaller in the rearview mirror. But even as they faded from sight, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still following us, that they were always following us. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We all knew what was happening, even if we couldn't explain it. And no matter where we went, it wouldn't stop. They wouldn't stop. Eventually, Mark pulled off onto a dirt road, the headlights illuminating a narrow path that led into the woods. It was the kind of place you'd never go unless you were desperate, and we were. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like gnarled fingers, casting long shadows on the ground. "Do you really think this is safe?" Katie asked, her voice barely steady. Mark shrugged, his face pale. "I don't know, but it's better than sitting in the open, waiting for them to show up." We parked the car and got out, the three of us standing there in the middle of the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine. It was quiet, too quiet. And then the sound came, that same familiar shuffling, soft at first, like it was far away, but it grew louder, closer. I turned, and there they were, a dozen of them, maybe more, standing just at the edge of the trees, their featureless faces barely visible in the shadows. They didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough to send a wave of pure, unfiltered terror through my body. Katie clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What do we do?" I had no answer. Mark was pacing again, muttering to himself, but I could tell he was just as lost as we were. "They want something," I said, my voice hollow. "They're not just standing there for nothing. They want something from us." "But what?" Mark asked, his voice desperate. "What do they want?" I shook my head, staring at the figures, those blank faces, those hollow eyes, or the lack of them. And then it hit me. That night with the Ouija board, the message it had given us. He is watching. I felt a chill run down my spine. I think they want us to open the door." "What door?" Katie asked, her voice trembling. "The door we didn't open," I said, remembering the way the planchette had jerked toward goodbye that night. We had asked too many questions. We had invited them in. And now they were here, waiting for us to finish what we started. Mark shook his head, his eyes wide. "No way! No way in hell I'm opening anything." The shuffling grew louder, closer. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. "We don't have a choice. If we don't open it, they're never going to stop. They'll follow us forever." Katie's grip tightened on my arm. "And if we open it, what happens then?" I didn't have an answer for that, but I knew one thing for sure. We couldn't keep running. Not anymore. With shaky hands, I reached into my bag, pulling out the Ouija board. I don't know why I brought it, but somehow I think I always knew this would be the only way out. The three of us sat down on the ground, surrounded by the forest and the figures at the edge of the trees, and placed our hands on the planchette. Mark swallowed hard. "What do we ask?" I hesitated, staring at the board. Then, with a deep breath, I asked the question that had been haunting me since this all started. "What do you want from us?" For a moment, nothing happened. The planchette sat still, unmoving. But then slowly, it began to move, spelling out the message one final time. "Why? Oh. Ooh." The air around us seemed to thicken, the shuffling growing louder, the figures inching closer. And in that moment, I realized the truth. They weren't waiting for us to open the door. They were waiting for us to understand that the door had already been opened, and we were never going to close it. We used a Ouija board to contact a relative. Now we all have the same nightmares. Part 1. The decision to play. All right, I never thought I'd be posting something like this on Reddit. I used to be the guy who laughed at stories about ghosts and hauntings, just one of those people who'd roll their eyes whenever a friend claimed to have seen something spooky. But after what happened last month, I'm not laughing anymore. So, it all started when my cousin Ethan brought over a Ouija board to a family get-together. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's how all horror stories begin. Trust me, I had the same thought. It was supposed to be a joke. Just some goofy family bonding activity while we were all hanging out at my grandmother's place, bored out of our minds. My grandmother had passed away about a year ago, and it's been weird in the house since. You know how old houses have that feeling? Like it's alive, watching you? It was subtle, nothing dramatic, but you'd hear little creaks at night or feel cold spots in the hallway. But we all just chalked it up to the place being, well, old. Anyway, we were in the living room, surrounded by old photo albums and weird knickknacks from my grandma's life, like one of those creepy porcelain doll collections people always seem to have for no reason. Ethan pulled out the Ouija board like it was some sort of party trick, grinning from ear to ear. "Let's contact Grandma," he said. "What could go wrong?" I was against it from the start. "Dude, that's messed up. She's been gone for a year. Let her rest." But you know how peer pressure works. My sister Emily thought it was hilarious, and my cousins all joined in. Even my aunt, Ethan's mum, was sort of into it. She wasn't big on supernatural stuff, but I guess she figured it might be comforting to try and talk to her mum one more time. So, we lit a few candles, because apparently that's what you do, dimmed the lights, and sat around this dusty old Ouija board like we were auditioning for a bad horror movie. Ethan was in charge naturally, and he told everyone to put their fingers on the planchette. You know, that little triangle thing that moves around the board. And just like that, we started. Ethan asked, "Grandma, are you here?" I thought it was ridiculous. I kept smirking, convinced one of them would push the planchette as a joke. For the first couple of minutes, nothing happened. The candle flames flickered, but that was probably just the draft coming from the old windows. We all sat there waiting. Then the planchette moved. Not in some big dramatic sweep like you'd see in a movie, but in this slow, deliberate shift across the board. It went to YES. Everyone looked at each other, wide-eyed, but no one said anything. I stared at Ethan, convinced he was pulling some sort of prank, but his hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was from excitement or fear. "Grandma," Ethan asked next, his voice cracking a little. "Are you okay?" The planchette shot to no. Now, this is where things got weird. My aunt, who had been quiet up until now, leaned forward and said in this low, shaky voice, "Mom, is it really you?" For a moment, the room felt like it got darker, like the shadows were creeping in from the corners. I swear, the temperature dropped a few degrees, but again, I was trying to rationalize it. Old houses, bad heating, whatever. The planchette slowly spelled out, HELP. At that point, I felt a pit form in my stomach. Everyone around the board seemed frozen, unsure what to do next. My sister, who was normally the brave one, looked pale. Ethan just stared at the board like it was going to jump up and bite him. "Help with what?" my aunt whispered, her voice trembling now. "What do you need?" The planchette didn't answer right away. It just sat there, unmoving, as if whatever, or whoever, was communicating, had hesitated. Then slowly, it began to move again. FINDME. Nobody spoke. We just sat there, staring at the letters, piecing them together in our heads. Find me. But Grandma was dead, buried, gone. What did that mean? That's when the candle closest to my aunt suddenly blew out. No breeze, no draft. It just flickered once and died. The room was dead silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The planchette, still resting under our fingertips, didn't move again. That was the last thing it spelled before we stopped. Find me. We all sat there in this suffocating silence until my aunt finally stood up, muttering something about not feeling well, and left the room. The rest of us awkwardly followed suit, brushing off the whole thing like it had just been some kind of fluke, some weird coincidence. But the thing is, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Find me. What did she mean? Why would she need help? Was this some leftover grief manifesting in a dumb Ouija board session, or was something else going on? I didn't know it at the time, but that was only the beginning. The real horror didn't start until that night, when the nightmares began. And not just for me, for all of us. Part 2. The first night. That night, I couldn't shake the weird feeling the Ouija board left me with. I kept trying to laugh it off, telling myself it was just a stupid game, but something about it had gotten under my skin. I headed to bed a little later than usual, replaying the session over and over in my head. How the planchette moved, the letters it spelled, the way the candle went out without warning. I've never been the type to get freaked out easily. I mean, I've seen plenty of horror movies, stayed up late watching creepy YouTube videos, the whole deal. But as soon as I crawled into bed and turned off the light, I had this strange sense of unease, like there was someone standing just outside my bedroom door. Of course, I knew no one was there. It was just my nerves, right? I rolled over, shut my eyes, and told myself to sleep it off. I must have drifted off, but it couldn't have been for long. The next thing I knew, I was awake again, lying flat on my back in the dark. At first, I didn't understand what had woken me up. There was no noise, no creaking floorboards, no voices, just this overwhelming sense that something was wrong. Then I realized I couldn't move. I tried to shift, to roll over, but my body felt like it was glued to the mattress. My chest was tight, like there was something heavy pressing down on me. Sleep paralysis, right? I'd read about it online but never experienced it myself. That's what I tried to convince myself it was, at least. But here's the thing. Sleep paralysis is usually just in your head. This didn't feel like it was in my head. I opened my eyes, and I swear to God, there was someone standing in the corner of my room. Just this dark shape, not fully there, but not nothing either. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew it was there. It was too tall to be one of my family members. It just stood there, watching. I wanted to scream, to jump out of bed and run, but I couldn't. All I could do was stare at this thing, frozen in place. My heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. It felt like hours, but it was probably just a few minutes. I kept telling myself, wake up, wake up, wake up. But nothing happened. Then it moved. It started to drift toward me, slow at first, like it was testing the waters. I couldn't hear footsteps, but the air in the room grew colder with each inch it got closer. My breath turned shallow, and my mind was racing. I tried so hard to scream, but it was like my throat was blocked. The shadowy figure reached the foot of my bed and stopped. It didn't do anything at first, just loomed there like it was deciding what to do next. My eyes were wide open, tears streaming down the sides of my face, but still, I couldn't move. Then, as if on cue, it bent over me. Its face, or what should have been a face, was just a void, a black hole where features should have been. I felt this pressure on my chest, like it was pushing down on me, pinning me further into the bed. Finally, I must have broken through whatever trance I was in, because I managed to let out this choked gasp, and the thing vanished. Just like that, it was gone. The room was still cold, but I could move again. I sat up so fast I nearly threw myself out of bed, gasping for air like I'd just come up from underwater. I spent the rest of the night sitting up, lights on, heart racing. No way was I going back to sleep after that. The next morning, I chalked it up to a nightmare. Maybe my brain was just playing tricks on me because of the Ouija board session. I mean, I had to sleep eventually, right? But when I came downstairs for breakfast, it became clear I wasn't the only one. My sister, Emily, was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into her coffee like it held the answers to life. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, pale, jittery. I thought maybe she'd stayed up late texting or something, but then she said something that made my stomach drop. "I couldn't move," she whispered, barely looking up at me. I woke up in the middle of the night and I couldn't move. It was like something was in the room with me. I stared at her, my mind racing. I hadn't told anyone about what happened to me the night before, and yet here she was, describing almost the exact same experience. "Did you see it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "It was in the corner, just standing there. I've never been that scared in my life. I don't think it was a dream." My heart was pounding again, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe we'd both just freaked ourselves out after the Ouija board thing. But before I could even say anything, Ethan walked in, looking just as bad as Emily. "Dude, I had the worst nightmare last night," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "I couldn't move. I felt like something was in the room, right next to me. I thought I was going to die." 3 people. 3 of us, all having the same experience, same night. Now, I was freaked out. I didn't want to believe it was anything supernatural, but at that point, I couldn't deny something was wrong, really wrong. That day, we didn't talk about it much. We just kind of existed in this awkward silence, avoiding eye contact, as if not acknowledging it would make it go away. But I knew we were all thinking the same thing. What had we let in? And that night, the nightmares came back. Part 3. The nightmares spread. The second night wasn't any easier. If anything, it was worse. By now, I'd convinced myself that the first night had to be some sort of fluke. Maybe the 3 of us were all just dealing with the stress of using that stupid Ouija board. You know, collective anxiety or whatever. But deep down, I had this gnawing feeling that it wasn't going to stop. I didn't want to go to bed. None of us did. Dinner was quiet. My aunt didn't mention what happened during the session, but she looked different, tense, on edge, like she was trying to pretend everything was fine. She had always been the practical one, the science over superstition type. But she kept glancing at the hallway that led to the bedrooms, like she was waiting for something to come out of the shadows. When it came time to turn in, I stayed up as late as I could, scrolling through my phone, watching random videos, trying to keep my mind off of everything. But eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I passed out with my phone still in my hand. That's when it started again. I was dreaming, I think. It felt like a dream, but at the same time, too vivid, too real. In the dream, I was back in the living room where we'd used the Ouija board, but something was off. The room was darker, like the shadows had swallowed all the light. The air felt thick, almost like it was suffocating me. I could hear whispers, faint and distant, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then I noticed the Ouija board. It was sitting on the coffee table, untouched, but the planchette was moving, slowly at first, then faster, like someone was furiously spelling something out. I tried to move, to back away from it, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. The planchette spelled out one word, over and over, help. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, like something was squeezing it shut. I couldn't breathe. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, filling the room with this unbearable noise. It felt like they were inside my head, like they were trying to get in. Then I saw it, the shadow. It was standing by the window this time, just a silhouette, barely there, but still unmistakably present. Its head was tilted, like it was watching me. The room grew colder. My chest tightened with fear, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to move, but it was no use. The shadow was closer now, moving toward me in that same slow, deliberate way. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes and wake up, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in this nightmare that felt too real. Just as the shadow reached me, its hand, or what I assumed was a hand, started to reach out. I could feel the pressure building in the room, like something terrible was about to happen. And then I woke up. But I didn't wake up in my bed. I was sitting on the floor of the living room, right in front of the coffee table where the Ouija board had been. The weird thing, the board was still there, right where we'd left it. And the planchette, it was resting on help. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, sweat pouring down my face. My mind was spinning. Had I sleepwalked? Had I somehow ended up downstairs without realizing it? That was the only explanation I could come up with, but it didn't feel right. I hurried back upstairs, too freaked out to even think about sleeping again. I didn't even bother turning off the lights in the living room. Screw that. I wasn't about to be alone in the dark with that thing. The next morning, I found out it wasn't just me. Ethan was already at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, staring blankly at a glass of orange juice. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept at all. When I asked him how he was doing, he just shook his head. "Dude," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had another dream. The same thing as last night. I couldn't move. It was there again, standing in the corner, just watching me. It feels, I don't know, like it's getting closer." My stomach twisted. I wanted to tell him about waking up in the living room, but before I could say anything, Emily walked in. She didn't say a word, just grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down, her face pale and her hands shaking. She didn't have to say anything. I could tell she'd had the same nightmare again. At this point, we were all terrified, but none of us wanted to admit it out loud. My aunt was still acting weird too, but she wasn't saying much. It was like we were all walking on eggshells, too scared to bring up what was really happening. That day, I tried to do some research. I mean, the logical part of me still wanted to believe there was some rational explanation. I googled sleep paralysis, mass hysteria, even hauntings, but nothing fit. Every article I read just made me feel worse. Then something strange happened. I got a text from my aunt. She had gone out earlier that morning, and it wasn't unusual for her to check in, but the text was odd. All it said was, "Don't go in the basement." I stared at the message for a long time. What basement? My grandma's house didn't even have one. I replied, asking her what she meant, but she never responded. And when she came back later that day, she acted like nothing was wrong. I tried asking her about the text, but she brushed it off, said it must have been a mistake. But I couldn't shake it. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a warning. That night, I stayed awake as long as I could, but eventually, I passed out again, phone in hand, lights still on. The nightmare was waiting for me, again. Only this time, it was worse. The shadow didn't just stand in the corner. It moved faster, almost like it was rushing toward me, like it was angry. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, surrounding me, drowning out my thoughts. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. But this time, something was different. There were scratches on my arm. Part 4. The basement. By this point, I knew we were in deep. The nightmares weren't going away. The shadow wasn't going away. And those scratches on my arm, yeah, they were real. No way to explain those away as a dream or a sleepwalking episode. After that night, I started wearing long sleeves, trying to cover them up. I didn't want to freak out the others, but I had a feeling I wasn't the only one waking up with marks. Ethan and Emily were getting quieter by the day. We didn't talk about the dreams anymore, but I could see it in their eyes. We were all going through the same thing. The worst part, my aunt. She was acting more distant, more paranoid. She barely spoke to us, and when she did, it was in these strange, cryptic comments, like that text about the basement. I was still trying to figure out what she meant by that, and she sure as hell wasn't giving me any answers. Then one night, everything came to a head. It was a little past midnight, and I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too scared to fall asleep. I'd taken to leaving the lights on, hoping maybe it would keep the shadow at bay. But no matter what I did, I knew the nightmares would come. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Faint, but steady, coming from somewhere below me. I figured it was my aunt moving around, but then they stopped, and for a moment, everything was dead silent. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Then the footsteps started again, but this time, they weren't coming from down the hall. They were coming from underneath me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Underneath me? That made no sense. There was no basement in this house. At least, none that I knew of. But the footsteps were unmistakable, like someone was pacing slowly, deliberately, just beneath the floorboards. I threw the covers off and crept down the hall, trying not to wake anyone. My heart was racing, and I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. But I followed the sound, and it led me to the hallway just past the kitchen. There, in the shadows, I saw it. A door. It wasn't one I'd noticed before, mostly because it was hidden behind an old heavy cabinet. The kind of cabinet you'd need two people to move. My stomach turned as I realized why I'd never seen it before. Someone, or something, had been hiding it. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to back away, to forget I'd ever found it. But I couldn't stop myself. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal handle, and slowly, I pulled the door open. A stairwell, leading down into pitch darkness. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring down into that black void, the air thick and cold, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to go down there. I knew I shouldn't go down there. But before I could even take a step, I heard the voice. It was soft at first, like a whisper just behind my ear. It wasn't clear, but it was familiar. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone. It sent a chill down my spine. It sounded like my grandmother. I don't know what possessed me to move, but my legs started working on their own, carrying me down the stairs before I even realized what I was doing. The further down I went, the colder it got, until my breath came out in short, visible puffs. The darkness was suffocating, and the air smelled stale, like something had been left down here for far too long. At the bottom of the stairs, I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The weak beam cut through the blackness, revealing an old, dusty basement cluttered with forgotten furniture and boxes stacked against the walls. And then I saw it. In the far corner, hidden behind a pile of old furniture, was a small, wooden door. It was different from the rest of the basement, like it didn't belong there. The wood was darker, the frame older. It had this unsettling feeling, like just looking at it made my skin crawl. I should have left right then and there, should have turned around and gone back upstairs, maybe even grabbed the others. But I didn't. I walked toward it. The door wasn't locked. It creaked open with this slow, agonizing groan, revealing a tiny room no bigger than a closet. Inside was nothing but a chair, and on that chair, a Ouija board. Not the one we'd used. This one was different, older. The wood was worn and darkened with age, and the letters were barely visible. But I knew what it was the moment I saw it. And next to it, resting on the floor, was the planchette. My hands shook as I reached down to pick it up, even though every part of me was screaming no. As soon as I touched it, That cold, oppressive feeling I'd had upstairs intensified. The air grew thicker, and I could feel something watching me, closing in. Then the whispers started again. This time, I could understand them. They were coming from everywhere, filling the tiny room, bouncing off the walls, and they were all saying the same thing, over and over. Find me. I dropped the planchette and backed away, stumbling out of the room, my heart pounding in my ears. I scrambled back up the stairs, not daring to look back, as if whatever was down there might follow me. I slammed the hidden door shut behind me, chest heaving, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The house was quiet again, but that silence, it wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're not alone, like something is waiting in the darkness, just out of sight. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to confront my aunt. I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. Whatever was happening, we had to deal with it together. But when I went to find her, she wasn't in the house. Her car was gone. No note, no explanation, just gone. We waited all day, but she never came back. And the nightmares? They didn't stop. Part 5. The truth we didn't want to find. After my aunt disappeared, things got worse, much worse. The nightmares were relentless, each one more vivid, more terrifying than the last. And the shadow, whatever it was, seemed to be getting bolder. It wasn't just standing in the corner anymore. It was moving, circling the bed, getting closer every night. I could feel it watching me, like it was waiting for something. We tried to keep it together, tried to act like everything was fine during the day, but none of us were sleeping. Ethan barely spoke, and Emily had taken to locking her door at night. Every morning we'd gather in the kitchen, dark circles under our eyes, pretending we weren't all terrified out of our minds. But the real breaking point came a few nights later. I was lying in bed, wide awake, waiting for the nightmare to start again, when I heard a noise from downstairs. It was subtle at first, like the sound of someone moving around quietly, trying not to be heard. I sat up, straining to listen. Maybe my aunt had come back. Then I heard the door to the basement creak open. Panic set in immediately. That basement, the one I never wanted to see again. I hadn't told Ethan or Emily about what I found down there. Hell, I barely understood it myself. But the thought of someone, or something, going down there again, was enough to get me out of bed. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to guide me through the house, and crept down the stairs as quietly as I could. The house felt heavier, like the walls were closing in, and every step made my heart race. When I reached the hallway, the basement door was wide open. This couldn't be happening. I forced myself to step forward, shining the light down the staircase, and that's when I saw him, Ethan. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring into the darkness. His face was blank, his eyes glazed over like he wasn't fully awake. I called his name, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, like he was in some kind of trance. I rushed down after him, grabbing his arm. "Ethan, what are you doing?" My voice was shaky, panic rising in my chest. But he didn't even look at me. He just whispered, in this low, flat voice I barely recognized. "She's down here." Cold fear washed over me. "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He pointed toward the small door in the back of the basement, the one that led to the room with the Ouija board, the one I'd sworn never to open again. "She wants us to find her," he muttered. "She needs help." I felt sick. This wasn't right. Ethan wasn't like this. I tugged at his arm, trying to pull him back up the stairs, but he wouldn't budge. His eyes were locked on that door, and then, without warning, he started walking toward it. I grabbed him, desperate to stop him, but he was stronger than I expected, like he was being pulled by something. The air in the basement had changed. It was colder now, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. And I could feel it. Something was down there with us. Something that didn't belong. "Ethan, stop!" I pleaded, my voice shaking. But he didn't listen. He reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle, and in that moment, I knew I had to do something. I lunged forward, yanking him away from the door with all the strength I had, and he stumbled back, finally snapping out of whatever trance he was in. For a moment we just stood there, both of us breathing heavily, the basement eerily silent. Then the whispers started again. They were louder this time, surrounding us, filling the basement with that same haunting word, "Find me, find me." I grabbed Ethan's arm and practically dragged him up the stairs, slamming the door behind us. We locked it, pushed the cabinet back in front of it, and ran upstairs to wake Emily. She was already awake, standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale with fear. "I heard it," she whispered. The voice, it was in my room. We didn't go back to sleep that night. None of us did. We just sat in the living room, huddled together, waiting for the sun to rise, too scared to be alone. Every so often, I'd hear a faint thumping from the basement, like something was trying to get out, but I tried to ignore it. The next morning, I made a decision. We had to get rid of that Ouija board. Burn it. Bury it. I didn't care, just as long as it was gone. I wasn't going to let this thing take any more of us. But when we went back downstairs, the basement door was open again. The cabinet had been pushed aside, the door wide open, and the small room at the back, empty. The Ouija board was gone. We searched the whole basement, but it had disappeared, like it had never been there in the first place. The only thing left was the feeling, that cold, oppressive presence that seemed to hang in the air, watching us. And then we heard the front door open. We rushed upstairs, only to find my aunt standing in the doorway, looking pale and tired, like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were wide, and she was clutching something in her hand. It was the planchette. "I tried to stop it," she whispered, her voice shaky. "But it's too late. It's already found us." We all stood there, frozen, as she dropped the planchette on the floor. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to shift around us. That night, we all had the same dream. We were back in the basement, standing in front of that small wooden door. It was open, just a crack, and beyond it, we could see something moving in the darkness. A shape, barely visible, but unmistakably there. And as it moved closer, the whispers filled our heads again. "Find me." When I woke up, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever we had let in, whatever we had contacted that night with the Ouija board, it wasn't my grandmother, and it wasn't going to stop until it found what it was looking for. We left the house that morning, packed up everything and never went back. But the nightmares, they followed us. Every night, the same dream, the same whispers. Find me. And I know, deep down, that one day we won't be able to run from it anymore. The Ouija board said to dig in my basement. I didn't expect to find a body. Part 1. The game was supposed to be a joke. Alright, this is probably one of the weirdest things I've ever written, but I need to get it off my chest. I don't even know how to start this. I guess it all began about 2 weeks ago. My friends and I, we're not the kind of people who believe in supernatural stuff. I mean, we watch horror movies, sure, but it's all just for fun, right? At least that's what we thought. So, let me give you some context. It was a Saturday night, and my buddy Mike had the great idea of messing around with a Ouija board. You know, one of those cheap ones you can get at any toy store. We were bored, just looking for something to kill time. There were 4 of us there. Me, Mike, his girlfriend, Sarah, and my roommate, Jake. We'd been drinking a bit, so the whole idea seemed even funnier at the time. We set the board up on the coffee table in my living room. I still remember Sarah laughing about how this was such a dumb idea. I agreed with her. I mean, who really thinks they're going to contact spirits using a piece of cardboard, right? Anyway, we started asking the usual questions. Stuff like, is anyone here with us? And what's your name? At first, nothing happened. The planchette just sat there, unmoving. Mike was being his usual sarcastic self, mocking the whole thing, and honestly, I was about to call it a night. That's when the planchette started moving. And no, it wasn't one of us. I know people say that it's always someone pushing it, but I swear on everything I own, none of us were doing it. At first, it just slowly drifted to the yes on the board. We all looked at each other like, okay, who's messing with this? Jake even lifted his fingers off the planchette to prove he wasn't pushing it, but it kept moving. The thing is, it wasn't spelling out random letters like you'd expect. It was specific, too specific to be a joke. The planchette spelled out D-I-G. Now, I wasn't exactly sure what that was supposed to mean, but Jake, being the curious idiot he is, asked, "Where?" We all watched as the planchette slid, almost hesitantly, over the letters again. B-A-S-E-M-E-N-T. Yeah, basement. My basement. I should probably mention that I live in this old house. One of those places where the basement is more like a dungeon than anything else. It's cold, damp, and I rarely go down there. I use it to store junk I don't want to throw away, but I never actually spend time down there. Mike, half drunk and totally convinced it was some prank, thought this was hilarious. "Dude, your house is haunted. You're going to find a treasure chest down there or something," he joked. But Sarah wasn't laughing. I remember her sitting back in her chair, looking uncomfortable. "Maybe we should stop," she said, which surprised me because she was usually the one who loved ghost stories and all that creepy stuff. Mike ignored her and kept going. "What's down there?" he asked the board, grinning like this was all just a game. We all stared as the planchette spelled out another word. B-O-D-Y. At that point, I was done. Like, I didn't want to play anymore. Sure, it could have just been one of my friends trying to freak me out, but something about it felt off. The air in the room felt heavier, like the atmosphere had changed, and not in a fun, spooky way. More like oppressive. Jake laughed it off and said it was probably just a dumb coincidence, but he looked a little pale. Mike, of course, kept pushing. He asked the board who the body belonged to. I'll never forget how slowly the planchette moved this time. Y-O-U. That's when I shut the board. I couldn't deal with it anymore. I mean, I don't believe in ghosts or spirits or whatever, but there was no way I was going to keep playing with something that was telling me there was a body in my basement and that it belonged to me. The rest of the night was kind of awkward after that. We tried to move on, watch a movie or something, but there was this tension in the air. Sarah ended up leaving early, saying she had a headache. Jake stayed quiet, which was weird for him. He's usually the loudest guy in the room. Mike? Well, Mike just kept making jokes, but I could tell he was unsettled too. I mean, what do you even say after something like that? Everyone left eventually, and I was alone in the house. It was late, and the only sound was the creaking of the old floors and the occasional drip of water from the basement, which always had this weird, leaky pipe I kept meaning to fix. But after that night, the idea of going down there freaked me out more than usual. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My brain kept going back to that board, to the word body, and then to you. What did that even mean? Was it saying I was dead? Was it trying to tell me there was something down there I didn't know about? The thing is, I had lived in this house for almost 3 years by that point. It was an old place, yeah, but nothing ever felt haunted. No cold spots, no weird noises, nothing out of the ordinary. Just your typical creaky old house. But that night, I couldn't help but feel like the Ouija board was trying to tell me something. Something important. And it wasn't long before I realized the only way to find out was to dig in the basement. Part 2. Down the stairs. So I didn't sleep that night. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I'd hear weird sounds in the house. You know, those small creaks and groans that old homes make? Except they seemed louder, like someone was walking around. It could have been the wind, or maybe I was just freaked out from what happened with the Ouija board. But every time I heard one of those creaks, my mind went straight to the basement. It's funny how your brain can mess with you. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about the basement. It was just a place to dump old boxes and stuff I didn't need anymore. But after the Ouija board said dig, that place took on a whole different vibe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, waiting for me. By morning, I convinced myself I was being stupid. I mean, it was just a dumb game. People use Ouija boards all the time, and nothing happens, right? It was probably Mike pushing the planchette. He thought it'd be funny to freak me out, and maybe it worked a little too well. But then, around noon, I got this itch in the back of my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Dig in the basement. Those words were stuck in my head like a bad song. I figured maybe if I just went down there, poked around for a minute, I'd see there was nothing weird going on, and I could move on with my life. So I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement door. Now, I know this sounds cliché, but something about standing at the top of those stairs made me pause. There was this heavy, musty smell coming up from below, like the air hadn't moved down there in a while. And it was cold, colder than it should have been. It was a warm day, but the basement felt like the dead of winter. I'm telling you, I was getting major, don't go down there vibes, but curiosity got the better of me. I started down the stairs, the wood creaking under my feet. The light switch for the basement was busted, because of course it was, so I had to rely on my flashlight to see anything. The beam cut through the darkness, but the basement felt wrong. Like the walls were too close, and the shadows were too long. I don't know how to explain it, but the space just felt tighter than usual, like it was closing in on me. The basement wasn't big, just a single room with a low ceiling. Concrete floors, bare walls, and boxes stacked in the corners. But standing there, it felt like the room was different, like something was hiding just out of sight, waiting for me to make a move. I did a quick sweep with the flashlight, checking the corners, but everything looked normal. Old boxes of Christmas decorations, some furniture I didn't need, and a pile of junk I hadn't sorted through in years. There was nothing that screamed, dig here, or there's a body buried under your floor. I started to feel like an idiot, like I had let a stupid board game mess with my head. I almost turned around and went back upstairs, but then I noticed something weird. In the far corner of the room, near an old wooden workbench, the floor looked different. I don't know why I hadn't seen it before. The concrete was cracked, just a small line, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But what really caught my eye was the dirt. See, the basement floor was supposed to be solid concrete, but right there, in that corner, there was a patch of loose dirt. It was maybe the size of a doormat, and it looked fresh, like someone had just dug it up and hastily thrown the dirt back on top. I felt this cold shiver run down my spine. My flashlight flickered for a second, and I swear it got even colder in the room. That heavy, musty smell got stronger, and for a moment, I thought I heard something. A faint scratching sound, like something moving under the floor. I should have left. I know that now. But at the time, I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed an old rusty shovel that was leaning against the wall and made my way to the dirt patch. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I wasn't going to find anything. Maybe a mouse had burrowed in through the cracked concrete or something. But as soon as I started digging, I knew it wasn't that simple. The dirt was loose, way too loose for a basement floor. It came up easily, and before long, I was a foot deep in the ground. That's when I hit something solid. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a second, I thought it was just a rock or a pipe. But when I cleared away more dirt, I saw it was wood. Not just any wood. It was smooth, polished, and old. The kind of wood you'd find in an antique chest or a coffin. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it. I couldn't move. My hands were shaking, and my breath felt trapped in my throat. Everything in me was screaming to stop, to cover the hole and pretend I never saw it. But I kept digging. Eventually, I uncovered enough of the wood to see that it wasn't a coffin, at least not in the traditional sense. It was more like a box, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The wood was dark and rotting in some places, but it was still intact. There were no markings on it, no symbols or anything to suggest what it was for. Just a plain, old, wooden box, buried under my basement. I should have stopped then. I should have called someone. Anyone. But I was in too deep, both literally and figuratively. I had to know what was inside. I grabbed a crowbar from the workbench and wedged it under the edge of the lid. My whole body was tense, my mind racing with 1,000 possibilities, none of them good. With a grunt, I pried the lid open, and that's when the smell hit me. It was like a punch to the face, this thick, nauseating stench of decay and rot. I stumbled back, gagging, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The box was open, but I couldn't see inside, not yet. I didn't want to see, but I had to. I stepped forward, shining the flashlight into the box, and that's when I saw it, a body. Part 3. The eyes were open. There was a moment where time just stopped. I swear my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. You know that feeling when your mind tries to protect you from something too messed up to handle? That's what happened. I just stood there, staring into the box, refusing to believe what I was seeing. The body was old, like really old. Whoever it was had been down there for decades, maybe even longer. The skin was shriveled and leathery, stretched tight over brittle bones. The clothes were rotten, barely clinging to what was left of the corpse, just tatters of fabric that had probably once been a suit or a dress. I couldn't really tell. The smell, though, it was the worst thing I've ever experienced. It was thick, suffocating, like the air itself was rotting around me. I wanted to turn and run. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of that basement, to shut the lid and pretend I never opened it. But I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the floor. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that maybe it was some kind of sick prank. Maybe Mike had gone to extreme lengths to freak me out, but I knew better. This was real. And then, the worst part, the eyes. They were still there. I know it sounds impossible, but they were there, sunken deep into the skull, but unmistakable. Hollow, empty sockets with something wet and glistening inside. They stared up at me, wide and unblinking, like they had been waiting for me to find them. My heart was pounding so loud in my ears I thought it would explode. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw the eyes move. That was when I finally snapped out of it. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered onto the floor, rolling away, casting wild shadows around the room. The beam landed on the far wall, leaving the box, and whatever was inside it, bathed in darkness. My stomach churned and I gagged, barely holding back the bile rising in my throat. I had to get out. I needed to call someone. Anyone. The cops? A coroner? Who do you even call when you find a body buried in your basement? I scrambled for the stairs, my hands shaking so badly I nearly tripped over my own feet. But just as I reached the bottom step, I heard it. A low, creaking sound, like old wood bending under pressure. It was subtle at first, almost like the house was settling, but it came from behind me, from the box. I stopped, halfway up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I didn't want to look back. I shouldn't have looked back. But I did. The lid of the box was moving, slowly. It creaked open inch by inch, as if something inside was trying to get out. My whole body froze. I watched in horror as the lid rose, and then it stopped. For a moment, everything went still again. The only sound was my ragged breathing, echoing in the empty basement. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe a trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me. But when I saw what happened next, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The body moved. Not a lot, just a twitch, a slight, jerking movement of the hand. It wasn't like in movies, where the dead rise up all at once. No, this was worse. It was slow, deliberate, like the corpse was testing its limbs after lying still for God knows how long. One of the hands, bony and claw-like, shifted against the side of the box, fingers curling, scraping against the wood with a soft, scratching sound. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt paralyzed, like I was suffocating on fear. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was stuck in place, watching as the thing in the box came to life. The flashlight, still lying on the floor, flickered again. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, crawling up the walls like they were alive too. And in that flickering light, I saw something I'll never forget. The corpse's head turned. It was slow, but it moved. The neck cracked, dry and brittle, as the head tilted upward, and those eyes, those sunken, hollow eyes, locked onto mine. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My legs finally kicked into gear, and I bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. I slammed the basement door behind me so hard the whole house shook. I locked it. Then, for good measure, I shoved the kitchen table in front of it. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. My mind was racing, and I couldn't think straight. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that I was hallucinating, but I knew deep down that wasn't true. There was something down there, something alive. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it, and dialed Mike's number. I didn't care that it was early, or that he'd probably still be asleep. I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. He picked up after a few rings, his voice groggy. "Dude, it's like 9 in the morning. What do you want?" "Mike," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I found it. I found the body." There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment, and then Mike's voice, no longer groggy, but deadly serious. "What?" "I'm not kidding," I stammered. "There's a body in my basement, and it moved." For the first time in our friendship, Mike didn't make a joke. "You need to get out of the house," he said, his voice low. "Now. Don't go back down there. Don't even think about it. Just leave." "I can't," I said. I don't know what to do." Before he could respond, I heard it again. The scratching. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. Coming from the other side of the basement door. Something was moving down there. "I have to go," I whispered into the phone. "Dude, don't," Mike started to say, but I hung up before he could finish. My heart was racing, my whole body trembling. I could hear the scratching growing louder, more insistent, like whatever was down there was trying to get out. I stood there, staring at the door, the sound of scratching and scraping filling the silence. And then, the doorknob started to turn. Part 4. The Whispering. I stood frozen, watching the doorknob twist back and forth. It wasn't fast, not like someone violently trying to break in. It was slow and deliberate, almost like whatever was down there wanted me to know it was coming. Each turn of the knob sent a fresh wave of terror through me, and all I could think was, this isn't happening. But it was. The scratching had stopped. Now, it was just the knob, creaking and clicking, like it was deciding when to open. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was Mike, calling me back, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't do anything. All I could do was stare at the basement door, heart hammering in my chest, waiting for it to swing open. Then, it stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Just this awful, suffocating silence that felt heavier than any noise could have been. I let out a shaky breath, not even realizing I'd been holding it, and for a split second, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. Maybe whatever was down there had given up. I took a step back, trying to convince myself that I was safe. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just an old house, and I was freaking myself out over nothing. I could hear my own thoughts spiraling, trying to rationalize everything, when the basement door made a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It whispered. I know how that sounds. Trust me, I can hardly believe it myself. But I heard it, clear as day, a voice coming from behind the door. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A soft, raspy whisper that sent ice shooting down my spine. At first, I couldn't make out what it was saying. It was muffled, like it was speaking through gritted teeth, almost too faint to hear. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Let me out. I backed up, tripping over the kitchen chair, barely catching myself before I fell. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in cement. The voice came again, a little louder this time, but still so faint, like it was struggling to be heard. Let me out. I couldn't move. My whole body was shaking. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but no words came out. I was paralyzed, staring at the door, waiting for whatever was on the other side to make its next move. And then, as if in response to my silence, the voice changed. It wasn't asking anymore. Let me out. It was louder this time, angry, desperate. I could hear it, clear as day. And it wasn't a request. It was a demand. The door rattled as though something was pushing against it from the other side, and the knob started to turn again. But this time, it wasn't slow. It twisted violently, shaking in its socket, and I heard the sound of wood groaning under pressure. Something was trying to force the door open. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the kitchen table as I grabbed the nearest chair and wedged it under the door handle. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had no idea if a chair would do anything to stop it, but I wasn't thinking clearly. The door stopped shaking for a moment, as if whatever was on the other side was considering what I'd done. I held my breath, praying it would just go away. But then, the whisper came again. I see you. This time, it wasn't coming from behind the door. It was coming from inside the room. I whipped around, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My eyes darted around the kitchen, scanning every shadow, every corner. But there was nothing there. The room was empty. But I knew what I'd heard. The whisper was in the room with me. I see you. The voice slithered through the air, low and guttural, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt a cold draft like icy fingers brushing against the back of my neck, and I whipped around again. Nothing. The door rattled behind me, violently shaking on its hinges now. The chair I'd wedged under the knob slid an inch across the floor. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. I grabbed my keys off the counter and bolted for the front door. I didn't even bother locking it behind me as I stumbled outside, gasping for air. The sun was out, shining bright, but the warmth didn't reach me. My whole body was ice cold, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. I jumped into my car, hands trembling so bad I could barely get the key into the ignition. I peeled out of the driveway, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. My phone buzzed again, Mike calling for the third time, but I still couldn't bring myself to answer. What would I even say? Hey man, I found a dead body, and now it's whispering at me through my walls. He'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had lost my mind. I drove around aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. I ended up in a parking lot outside a gas station, staring at my steering wheel, my heart still pounding in my chest. My phone buzzed again, and this time I forced myself to answer. Dude, what's going on? Mike's voice came through, sounding more concerned than I'd ever heard him. You hung up on me, and I've been calling. What happened? My throat was dry, and I could barely get the words out. There's something in my house, Mike. Something in the basement. What do you mean, something? Mike asked, his voice tense. I found the body, like the Ouija board said. It's real. It's in a box, and now something's trying to get out. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought he didn't believe me. But then he said, "Listen, don't go back there. Stay at my place tonight. We'll figure this out, but don't go back alone, okay?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, okay, I won't." But I didn't keep that promise, because as I sat there, gripping the phone, staring out at the empty parking lot, I heard the whisper again. "You can't run." It was faint, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing, but it was there. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from inside the car. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking as I whipped around in my seat, looking at the empty back seat, the dark corners of the car, the rearview mirror. Nothing, but I knew deep down that it was still with me. The thing from the basement. It wasn't trapped down there anymore. It was following me. Part 5. It followed me home. Sitting there in the car, the whisper still hanging in the air, I realized something horrible. Whatever I had let out of the basement wasn't bound to the house. It wasn't tied to that dark, rotting box. It was here with me, and I had no idea how to get away from it. My phone was still on the floor of the car, Mike's voice faintly calling my name through the speaker, but I couldn't focus. The whisper had gotten louder, more insistent. It was everywhere now. I could feel it crawling under my skin, like it was sinking into me. I thought about going to Mike's place, but what good would that do? I couldn't bring this thing to him. I didn't even know what it was, let alone how to stop it. All I knew was that it wanted something from me. I had to go back. I don't know why I thought that was the answer, but it was like a pull, a force dragging me toward the house. Maybe it was the whisper, worming its way into my thoughts. Or maybe some part of me just knew I couldn't run forever. Whatever this thing was, it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. So, I turned the car around and drove back. The house looked different when I pulled up. It wasn't just the usual creepy old house vibe. It was worse. The windows looked darker, like the shadows inside had taken over. The air was thick, heavier than before, and even from the driveway, I could feel that cold creeping back into my bones. It was like the whole place was watching me. I almost turned around and drove off again, but before I could make a decision, I heard it. The front door creaked open on its own. I hadn't unlocked it. I hadn't touched it. It just opened slowly, like it was inviting me back inside. Against every shred of logic, I got out of the car. My legs felt like lead as I walked toward the house, the whisper louder with every step I took. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to know what was waiting for me, but I had no choice. The door swung shut behind me as soon as I crossed the threshold, the sound echoing through the house. The kitchen was just as I'd left it, the chair still wedged under the basement door, the air still cold and stale. But the whisper was louder now, coming from below, seeping up through the cracks in the floor. "Come, back!" I walked toward the basement door, heart pounding in my chest. The chair I'd used to block the door slid away on its own, as if something had pushed it aside. The doorknob turned again, and this time, the door creaked open without me touching it. I should have run. I should have left the house and never looked back, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me down those stairs. The flashlight in my hand felt useless, the beam barely cutting through the darkness as I descended. The basement felt different now. Colder, darker. The shadows were thicker, clinging to the walls, and the smell. God, the smell was worse than ever. That sickening stench of decay hung in the air, so strong I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. The box was still there, in the corner where I'd left it, the lid wide open. But now, it wasn't just the body. There was something else, something waiting. I couldn't see it at first, but I could feel it, like a pressure pushing down on me, suffocating me. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a low, throaty sound, like breathing. Slow and shallow, like it was coming from deep within the shadows. I stepped closer, my feet moving on their own, my heart racing. The beam of the flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I saw it. Standing just behind the box, half hidden in the dark. It wasn't the corpse. No, this was something else. Tall, impossibly thin, with long, spindly limbs and a face that barely resembled a human one. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight, the bones underneath pressing against it. And those eyes, those same hollow, sunken eyes that had been in the box, were staring right at me. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, waiting for something. That's when I realized it wasn't just watching me. It wanted me to finish what I'd started. The whisper returned, soft at first, then louder, coming from everywhere at once. "You... let me... out." I stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in my hand, the light flickering as the thing in the shadows started to move. Its limbs creaked and groaned like old wood, each step slow and deliberate, as if it was testing its body for the first time in years. My back hit the wall, and I dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, the beam rolling away, casting the basement in almost total darkness. The only thing I could see now was the outline of the creature, towering over me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. Finish. It... The word slithered through the dark, and I knew what it wanted. It didn't want to kill me. Not yet. It wanted me to replace it. I don't know how I knew, but I could feel it. This thing had been trapped here for decades, maybe even longer. And when I opened that box, I didn't just release it. I took its place. This was a trade. I was the body now, the one who would rot in that box while it walked free. The air around me grew colder, and I felt my legs give out. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as the shadows closed in. My mind was screaming, but my body wouldn't move. The darkness was swallowing me, pulling me under, and I knew I had lost. The last thing I heard before everything went black was that same awful whisper. "Thank you." When I woke up, I was back in the basement, but something was different. The box was closed. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching, and looked around. The room was empty. The creature, whatever it was gone. The air felt lighter, the shadows less oppressive, but the smell was still there. That awful, rotting stench. I walked over to the box, half expecting it to spring open again, but it didn't. The lid was sealed tight, just as I'd found it before. For a moment, I thought it was over, that maybe I'd beaten it somehow. But when I reached out to touch the box, something cold brushed against my skin. I pulled my hand back, heart racing, and that's when I heard it again. From inside the box, that same soft whisper. "Let me out."